called the lady Miss Smith. She phones and says, "Is this Pastor Hagee?" I said, "Yes, it is." She said, "Would you come and pray for me?"
Long before millions watched him on television or politicians sought his endorsement, John Hagee was simply a preacher's son growing up in a deeply religious Texas household. Faith wasn't just part of his family's routine, it shaped every aspect of his childhood. His father was a respected Pentecostal minister, and generations before him had filled pulpits across the state. While most children dreamed about becoming athletes or businessmen, John's future seemed almost predetermined. Every Sunday he stood before church members, singing hymns and learning the rhythms of ministry, before he was even old enough to understand their meaning. Yet beneath that polished image was a teenager with very different ambitions. He loved sports, competition, and the idea of building a life far beyond the church walls. At that point, almost no one imagined he would one day become one of America's most recognizable religious figures. But everything he thought he wanted was about to disappear in a single, unforgettable night. And that's where his story takes a dramatic turn. As graduation approached, John's future looked almost perfect. He had earned respect as an outstanding student, excelled in several sports, and even secured an appointment to the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point. It was the kind of opportunity most families could only dream about. Friends expected him to become a military officer with a bright career ahead. But during a church revival in 1958, something happened that he would later describe as life-changing. Sitting quietly in the back pew, he suddenly felt an overwhelming conviction that his purpose wasn't leading soldiers. It was leading congregations. Within days, he walked away from the future everyone expected. Instead of preparing for West Point, he enrolled in Bible college, leaving behind scholarships, athletics, and a carefully planned career. To outsiders, the decision seemed unbelievable. But for John, it marked the beginning of a mission he believed God had chosen for him. What followed would test that conviction more than anyone expected. Bible college wasn't filled with luxury or instant success. John spent his weekdays buried in theology classes while working long hours to pay his bills. On weekends, he traveled anywhere churches would invite him, preaching to small congregations that could barely fill a few rows of pews. Those early years became an unexpected training ground. Every sermon sharpened his speaking style, teaching him how to hold attention, build emotion, and leave audiences wanting more. Unlike many young ministers, he also pursued higher education, earning degrees in history, education, and educational administration. He even coached championship sports teams, proving he could motivate people both on the field and behind the pulpit. Those leadership skills would later become one of his greatest advantages. Looking back, these weren't just ordinary years of preparation. They were the foundation of a ministry that would eventually reach millions around the world. But before that could happen, he had to take an enormous gamble. By the mid-1960s, John Hagee had already founded his first church and watched it grow into a thriving congregation. Everything suggested his ministry was headed in the right direction. Then, without much warning, he resigned. The decision stunned many of his followers. Instead of accepting a larger position elsewhere, he chose something that looked almost impossible. He took over a struggling church with only about 25 members. To many observers, it appeared to be a major step backward, yet John saw an opportunity where others saw failure. He renamed the congregation, reorganized its mission, and threw himself into rebuilding from the ground up. Every sermon, outreach event, and ministry program was designed with one goal: growth. Slowly, attendance began to climb. What had once looked like a risky mistake started transforming into something much bigger. Few people realized they were witnessing the birth of a religious movement that would soon stretch far beyond San Antonio. And the next chapter would change everything forever. The tiny congregation didn't stay small for long. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, attendance exploded as John Hagee's energetic preaching attracted thousands of new followers. Eventually, the church relocated to a massive campus and adopted the name Cornerstone Church, signaling that this was no longer just another neighborhood congregation. It became one of the largest churches in Texas, welcoming more than 20,000 members and drawing visitors from across the country. At the same time, Hagee expanded beyond the pulpit. His sermons began airing on television, his books climbed bestseller lists, and conferences packed arenas filled with devoted supporters. He wasn't simply leading a church anymore. He was building an organization with national influence. To admirers, it was evidence of extraordinary leadership and unwavering faith. But as the ministry grew larger, so did the questions surrounding it. Behind the impressive crowds and growing success, critics had begun paying closer attention. And soon, the spotlight would reveal a side of the empire few people were prepared to see. What began as a local ministry soon transformed into something far more powerful. As Cornerstone Church continued growing, John Hagee realized his message could reach people far beyond San Antonio. Television broadcasts expanded across the United States and eventually into millions of homes worldwide. Radio programs, conferences, best-selling books, and speaking engagements turned him into one of the most recognizable evangelical pastors in America. Every new platform strengthened his influence, allowing supporters to follow his sermons without ever setting foot inside his church. By the early 2000s, the ministry was generating millions of dollars annually, operating more like a major media organization than a traditional church. To followers, this success proved that God was blessing the ministry. But critics saw something very different. They questioned whether faith had become intertwined with business on a scale few religious organizations had ever reached. Those concerns would only grow louder as financial records became public, and the numbers people discovered left many asking difficult questions. One of the biggest reasons John Hagee became such a polarizing figure was his teaching about prosperity. He often preached that generosity toward God would open the door to financial blessings, encouraging believers to give faithfully while trusting that God would provide even more in return. For countless supporters, this message inspired hope during difficult times and strengthened their faith. They believed giving was an act of obedience that invited God's favor. But not everyone agreed. Many pastors and biblical scholars argued that these teachings placed too much emphasis on wealth instead of spiritual growth. Some accused prosperity preachers of encouraging vulnerable people to donate money while expecting miracles that might never come. Online critics began revisiting old sermons, questioning whether certain Bible verses were being interpreted to encourage larger offerings rather than deeper faith. The debate spread far beyond church walls, becoming one of the defining controversies surrounding Hagee's ministry. But money wasn't the issue that would generate the biggest headlines. If there was one cause that defined John Hagee almost as much as his preaching, it was his unwavering support for Israel. He repeatedly described the nation as central to biblical prophecy, insisting that events in the Middle East were directly connected to the future described in Scripture. Those beliefs led him to establish one of America's largest pro-Israel Christian organizations, bringing together politicians, religious leaders, and millions of supporters. Presidents, senators, and international officials regularly appeared at events connected to his ministry, recognizing the enormous influence he had built among evangelical voters. To his followers, standing with Israel was a spiritual responsibility. But critics argued that his prophetic interpretations blurred the line between religion and politics, raising concerns about how biblical predictions were influencing real-world policy discussions. The more his influence expanded, the more attention people paid to his older sermons. And hidden within those recordings was one statement that would return to haunt him decades later. When it resurfaced, the backlash was immediate. Years after it was first delivered, one of John Hagee's sermons suddenly returned to the national spotlight. During the 2008 presidential campaign, recordings from the late 1990s resurfaced online, drawing widespread criticism. In the message, Hagee discussed the Holocaust within the context of biblical prophecy, making remarks that many listeners found deeply offensive. News outlets quickly picked up the story, and what had once been an obscure sermon became a national controversy almost overnight. Religious leaders, political commentators, and Jewish organizations condemned the comments, arguing they crossed a moral line. The timing made matters even more explosive, because prominent political figures had recently welcomed Hagee's public support. Suddenly, those endorsements became liabilities. What had been intended as a political advantage turned into a public relations crisis that dominated headlines for days. Although Hagee later defended and clarified his intentions, the damage had already been done. But that controversy opened the door to even more scrutiny of his past statements. Once journalists and critics began digging through decades of sermons, they uncovered far more than a single controversial message. Old remarks about religion, politics, prophecy, and world events resurfaced one after another, each creating fresh waves of debate. Critics accused Hagee of promoting divisive rhetoric through comments about Catholicism, Islam, and various social issues, while supporters insisted his words were frequently taken out of context or misunderstood. Every interview, sermon, and book seemed to face renewed examination. Even years later, whenever Hagee appeared at a major public event, those older controversies immediately returned to the conversation. Instead of fading into history, they became a permanent part of his public image. To supporters, he remained a fearless preacher, willing to defend his beliefs regardless of criticism. To opponents, the repeated controversies painted a very different picture. And as his ministry entered its later years, one question continued to grow louder. Was his remarkable legacy being overshadowed by the very controversies he could never seem to escape? The Hitler controversy wasn't the only issue fueling criticism. As more of John Hagee's older sermons resurfaced, religious leaders from several faiths began challenging statements he had made over the years. Among the loudest objections came from Catholic organizations, which pointed to sermons where Hagee described the Catholic Church in harsh prophetic terms. Those remarks sparked national debate, especially after his growing political influence placed him under an even brighter spotlight. Facing mounting pressure, Hagee eventually expressed regret for comments that many Catholics found offensive, saying some of his words had been misunderstood or taken out of context. While the apology eased tensions for some, many critics believed it didn't fully address the concerns. To supporters, he was simply defending his interpretation of Scripture without compromising his beliefs. To opponents, it reflected a pattern of inflammatory rhetoric that continued resurfacing whenever his influence expanded. The controversy reminded everyone that the larger his platform became, the more closely every past statement would be examined. But the criticism didn't stop with one religious community. It was about to grow even wider. Not long after the debate surrounding Catholicism, another series of remarks placed Hagee at the center of national headlines. During interviews and public appearances, he made sweeping statements about Islam that critics described as deeply offensive. His comments quickly spread through television, newspapers, and online discussions, triggering fierce reactions from Muslim organizations and civil rights groups. Supporters argued he was criticizing extremist interpretations of religion and speaking from his understanding of biblical prophecy. Critics disagreed, saying his words unfairly portrayed an entire faith through the actions of a small minority. The disagreement became another defining chapter in his public career, reinforcing the image of a pastor who rarely softened his message, even when controversy followed. Whether people admired his willingness to speak boldly or condemned the language he used, one thing became impossible to deny. Every public statement now carried national attention, and soon, his views on modern culture would ignite yet another heated debate. As American society changed, John Hagee became increasingly vocal about issues involving family, gender, and morality. His sermons promoted traditional Christian values, encouraging what he believed were biblical roles for men and women, while criticizing many of the cultural shifts taking place across the country. These messages resonated strongly with conservative audiences, who felt their beliefs were being pushed aside in modern society. But others viewed the same sermons very differently. Critics argued that his teachings marginalized women and LGBTQ individuals, turning complex social issues into moral battles. Television appearances and online clips spread these messages far beyond his congregation, ensuring that even people who had never attended Cornerstone Church became familiar with his opinions. Every new debate seemed to strengthen his reputation among loyal followers, while attracting even more opposition from those who disagreed. By now, Hagee had become more than a pastor. He was a national cultural figure. Then he began connecting world events to biblical prophecy in ways that stunned even longtime observers. John Hagee didn't see major world events as random tragedies. Instead, he often connected them to biblical prophecy, suggesting they reflected God's response to the spiritual condition of nations. After Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, comments linking the disaster to divine judgment drew widespread criticism from religious leaders, journalists, and the public. Years later, when Ebola dominated international headlines, he again suggested America should reflect on its relationship with Israel and God's plan for the future. Supporters believed he was warning people to return to biblical values before it was too late. Critics accused him of turning human suffering into prophetic lessons without evidence. These statements became some of the most controversial moments of his ministry because they blurred the line between faith, politics, and current events. Regardless of where people stood, his ability to command national attention remained undeniable. But his growing political influence would soon become just as controversial as his preaching. By this point, John Hagee's influence stretched far beyond church walls. Presidential candidates sought his endorsement, lawmakers attended his events, and influential political donors viewed him as one of the most powerful voices among evangelical Christians. His unwavering support for Israel made him especially influential in conservative circles, where foreign policy often overlapped with religious belief. Yet that political visibility came with enormous risks. Every controversial sermon, interview, or public statement suddenly carried consequences far beyond his congregation. Critics argued that his ministry had become too closely connected with partisan politics, while supporters believed he was courageously defending biblical principles in the public square. The debate intensified as Cornerstone Church hosted high-profile political gatherings that blurred the traditional separation between ministry and campaigning. To admirers, Hagee was standing firm in turbulent times. To critics, he had transformed the pulpit into a political platform. And while those debates dominated headlines, another question was quietly becoming impossible to ignore: the astonishing amount of money flowing through his ministry. As John Hagee's influence expanded, so did questions about the finances behind his growing ministry. Public tax filings showed that his television network and related organizations were bringing in millions of dollars each year, making Cornerstone one of the most financially successful ministries in the country. Supporters saw those numbers as proof that the ministry was reaching lives on a massive scale through television, books, conferences, and humanitarian work. Critics, however, focused on something else entirely. They pointed to reports of executive compensation, ministry assets, and the luxurious resources connected to the organization, arguing that such wealth seemed difficult to reconcile with the humble lifestyle often associated with Christian leadership. The debate became even more intense because Hagee frequently encouraged viewers to give generously, teaching that faithful giving could unlock God's blessings. While many believers embraced that message with confidence, others questioned whether financial promises were being emphasized too heavily. As discussions spread across social media and investigative reports, the ministry found itself facing increasing scrutiny. But the financial debate was only part of a much bigger picture, because attention soon shifted from the ministry's accounts to Hagee's personal lifestyle. As criticism over ministry finances continued, people began looking beyond annual reports and focusing on John Hagee's personal life. Articles and online commentators discussed estimates of his wealth, expensive properties, and other high-value assets connected to retirement holdings and years of successful book sales. Supporters argued there was nothing inappropriate about a pastor earning income from decades of writing, broadcasting, and leading one of America's largest churches. They believed his success reflected years of dedication rather than personal excess. Critics disagreed, saying the image of luxury contrasted sharply with the message of sacrifice found throughout the New Testament. Every new report reignited debates about whether modern megachurch leaders should live differently from the people supporting their ministries. The discussion became one more chapter in the growing list of controversies surrounding Hagee's career. Even those who admired his preaching admitted that public perception had become increasingly complicated. And while those arguments continued, politics once again brought his ministry into the national spotlight. The relationship between faith and politics reached another turning point when Cornerstone Church hosted major political gatherings that attracted nationally recognized conservative figures. Images of campaign-style speeches inside the church quickly spread online, prompting fresh criticism from watchdog organizations and religious observers alike. Some argued that the events blurred the line between spiritual leadership and partisan activism, raising questions about the responsibilities of tax-exempt religious organizations. Hagee's supporters pushed back, insisting that pastors have every right to speak about issues affecting the nation and encourage civic involvement. To them, remaining silent would have been a failure of leadership. Opponents saw something entirely different, believing the church had become deeply intertwined with political movements rather than focusing solely on ministry. Regardless of perspective, the headlines ensured that Hagee remained one of the most talked-about religious leaders in America. But while public debates intensified, another challenge was unfolding behind the scenes, one that no amount of influence could prevent. After decades of constant preaching, traveling, and public appearances, John Hagee eventually faced challenges that every public figure must confront. His health became a growing topic of discussion, especially after testing positive for COVID-19 during the pandemic. Because of his age, many followers feared the worst, and churches across the country prayed for his recovery. Fortunately, he returned to the pulpit after receiving treatment, determined to continue preaching despite the physical demands that came with advancing age. Even so, observers noticed visible changes. The pace that had once defined his ministry was beginning to slow, and questions naturally emerged about what the future of Cornerstone Church might look like. For the first time in decades, conversations weren't centered only on controversy or influence. They were also about succession. And that quiet transition was already happening long before many people realized it. While John Hagee remained the public face of Cornerstone Church, the ministry was already preparing for its next chapter. His son, Matthew Hagee, gradually stepped into a larger leadership role, taking on more preaching responsibilities and becoming increasingly visible during major church events. Rather than announcing a sudden retirement, the transition unfolded slowly, allowing the congregation to grow comfortable with the next generation of leadership, while John continued serving as the founding pastor. To supporters, it reflected careful planning that would preserve the ministry's stability for years to come. Yet critics wondered whether the succession also ensured that the influence, finances, and controversies surrounding the organization would continue long after its founder eventually stepped aside. Even as leadership responsibilities shifted, John Hagee remained the symbolic center of the ministry, making appearances, delivering sermons, and maintaining his national profile. But just when it seemed the transition was settling into place, one public appearance would revive decades of old controversies all over again. Just when it seemed the conversation surrounding John Hagee had begun to settle, one appearance thrust him back into the center of national debate. His participation in a major pro-Israel rally in Washington, D.C., reignited criticism that many believed had been left in the past. Within hours, social media users, journalists, and advocacy groups began resurfacing decades-old sermons, interviews, and controversial remarks. Headlines quickly shifted away from the event itself and focused instead on Hagee's long history of disputed statements. Supporters argued that he had spent decades standing firmly with Israel and deserved recognition for that commitment. Critics countered that honoring such a polarizing figure ignored years of controversy that had never been fully resolved. Once again, the nation found itself divided. Some viewed him as a courageous pastor who refused to compromise his convictions. Others believed his past continued to overshadow his present. It was remarkable how, after so many years, the same debates could return with such intensity. But perhaps the biggest question wasn't about one rally. It was about the legacy he would ultimately leave behind. Ask 10 people about John Hagee, and you might hear 10 completely different stories. To millions of loyal followers, he's a passionate preacher who dedicated his life to spreading the gospel, defending Israel, and encouraging believers through decades of ministry. They've watched his sermons, read his books, and credit his teachings with strengthening their faith during life's hardest moments. But critics see an entirely different picture. They point to years of controversial statements, political activism, financial debates, and theological disagreements as evidence that his influence often extended beyond the role of a traditional pastor. These two perspectives have existed side by side for years, and neither side appears willing to change its mind. That's what makes Hagee's story so unusual. Very few religious leaders have inspired such intense admiration and equally intense criticism at the same time. And understanding how he reached that level of influence helps explain why the debate surrounding him has never truly disappeared. Whether people admired him or challenged him, few could deny what John Hagee managed to build. Starting with a relatively small congregation, he transformed Cornerstone Church into one of the largest and most influential ministries in America. Television broadcasts reached millions of households, best-selling books expanded his audience even further, and conferences attracted enormous crowds from across the country. His organization became more than a church. It evolved into a global brand that combined preaching, publishing, broadcasting, and political influence under one recognizable name. That remarkable growth demanded vision, determination, and relentless work over several decades. Yet success on that scale also guaranteed constant public scrutiny. The larger the ministry became, the more every sermon, financial report, interview, and public appearance attracted attention. In many ways, his greatest achievement also created his greatest challenge. Because when influence reaches that level, every mistake has the power to become part of history. Today, John Hagee remains one of the most recognizable figures in American evangelical Christianity. Even as leadership responsibilities gradually shift to the next generation, his name continues to spark passionate conversations among supporters and critics alike. Some remember the pastor who inspired millions through powerful sermons and unwavering convictions. Others remember the headlines, the controversies, and the public debates that repeatedly surrounded his ministry. The truth is that both stories now exist together, making his legacy far more complicated than either side often admits. Time has a way of reshaping reputations, and future generations may evaluate his life differently than those living through these events today. What seems certain is that his influence on modern evangelical culture, politics, and Christian media will continue to be discussed for years to come. But after everything we've uncovered, one final question remains. For more than 6 decades, John Hagee has remained one of the most influential and most controversial religious figures in America. His journey took him from a preacher's son in Texas to the leader of a global ministry that reached millions through churches, television, books, and public events. Along the way, he inspired countless supporters who viewed him as a fearless defender of biblical truth. At the same time, he faced repeated criticism over his sermons, political involvement, financial questions, and statements that continued resurfacing long after they were first made. Those competing narratives have become inseparable from his public image. Whether history ultimately remembers him as a visionary spiritual leader or as a deeply divisive public figure will depend on how future generations weigh both his accomplishments and his controversies. One thing, however, is beyond debate. Very few pastors have left a mark on American religious and political life as significant as John Hagee. And even now, as a new generation assumes leadership, the conversations surrounding his legacy show no signs of ending anytime soon.